Welcome everyone for this new Swift community live. So this evening I am with Krzysztof Zabłocki and we are going to talk about code generation in Swift, and Krzysztof is going to show us about his tool Sourcery Pro. So welcome Krzysztof.
Thank you for having me again. I remember being here in January, so a few months passed.
Yeah, we did a first video where you showed us how Sourcery, the regular Sourcery, was working, and in the meantime, you've released Sourcery Pro. So before we begin actually showing how it works, maybe you can tell us, like in a few sentences, well, first what you are doing as your job, and then what's the purpose actually of Sourcery Pro?
Yeah, sure. So I am a lead iOS developer at the New York Times. In general, I'm working as a consultant for different companies as well. So I help companies figure out the pragmatic improvements they can make to their projects, how they can optimize their team efficiency, how they can create better tooling, and just in general save them a lot of money by making their developers more efficient. And obviously my main gig is the Times, and for Times I've been working for 5 years. I build a lot of interesting systems for them, and we use Sourcery a lot as well. As for Sourcery itself, for people that didn't see it, is like a code generation tool that's a community standard used by 40,000 apps and used by very, very well-known applications like Airbnb or Bumble, for example. And Sourcery Pro is an extension of Sourcery. So it's underneath, it's still using Sourcery, but it offers you some extra use cases. And what's really cool about it is, even if you're not using Sourcery right now, Sourcery CLI, which is how you normally integrate the regular Sourcery, with Sourcery Pro, you don't have to add any dependency to your project. So you can simply get the application, whether it's through Mac App Store or direct purchase. And the moment you get it, you get a lot of code generation for free. There is nothing in your project you have to change. It's simply added as an extension to your Xcode. And other than having an extension, it also comes in bundled with like a fully blown code editor that you can use to automate your own boilerplate.
And so before we actually take a look at how Swift Sourcery Pro works and how it looks like, so you said it's distributed. One of the way to get it is through the Mac App Store, and actually in the description of the video there is a link. So if you want to try to win a free license for Sourcery Pro, there is a link to a tweet. You just have to retweet it, and tomorrow I will make the draw, and there are 10 licenses to win for the people who have retweeted it. So if you want to get a license, you have the link in the description. And that being said, so now let's take a look actually. So how Sourcery Pro works, what are the basic use cases?
Yeah, sure. So the nice thing about it is, it's not like a lot of people assume because the name is Sourcery. So some people assume that you have to be a Sourcery user, which is not the case. The moment you download the application and restart your Xcode, that's how extensions work, right? That's the limitation. Like whenever you add an application that adds extension, you have to restart your Xcode for it to pick it up. But the moment you do that, you get this editor, Sourcery Pro extra menu in your Xcode. This is all like, going through our official plugin system. There's no data being collected. There's literally zero network requests in current Sourcery that I'm doing. And I'm not sending any data or anything like that. So it's all sandboxed, by the way. So I couldn't even if I wanted to. And the moment you do that, you get a bunch of bundled templates. There are actually, I think, right now, 13 templates. I removed some of them for the demo, so to make it easier. But it comes bundled with very common use cases. So one of the most common use cases that we have to do right now is if you have an enum with associated values and you try to have conformance, unlike normal conformance you get from the system, so like with normal structs or with enums with normal values without the associations, you don't get the derived implementation. So you have to go and implement this code yourself. And if you ever wrote that code, it's a lot of boilerplate, right?
Yeah.
So if you get Sourcery Pro, this is just a simple click. So you go into Sourcery Pro, you select the enum codable, which is a template, and it will generate all the code for you. And you can drop this because it automatically does it for you. So now I can build the project and you can see it compiles correctly. And you see how much code it generated, right? Encoding, decoding. And this is like a bundle template, so it's opinionated, but you can go and edit it to look it differently. Like if you don't want to use subcontainers, you want to flatten the data, it's all up to you. The only thing is you don't have to do it, right? You don't have to write this manually anymore. You simply click, or you can actually use keyboard. So if you go into preferences and you go into key bindings, you could find it here, and you can attach a shortcut to your template. So rather, if there is something that you're doing a lot, like if you have a lot of enums or if you're doing a lot of mocks, you simply attach a shortcut, and then you just do it directly without the mouse. You just press a shortcut, and that's it, right? Very simple, very common use case. So some of the other use cases you get is like, for example, if you have another enum, let's go with enums first. So enums with associated values, right? You might want to display the list of the enumerations that you have. So just getting the key. That again is a simple template that's very few lines of code. So if you go into auto case name, oh, I broke something. Let's see. I'm not really sure what I broke. I'll see it later. I think that's not gonna work. Cool, live demos. Let's go with a different one.
Let's try another one.
That's what happens when you use development version of a tool you're presenting. So you have like a structure that represents your data. And let's say you want to start working on the UI for it. And Swift UI is all hot now, so you probably want to do that. But to get you started, you can simply generate use another template, and you immediately get the preview and the view to get you started. And it supports stuff like ranges, and you can do a lot of stuff here. That's one of the bundle templates. There is a tool. There's like a Sourcery CLI version that I wrote, which is called automatic settings, if people want to have this like for debug settings. But it wouldn't make a lot of sense for user-facing stuff, because user-facing stuff you usually want to polish. Like usually start with the same kind of code, but then you take it and you add small tweaks, make it nicer and cooler.
And what
so this basically
maybe it's like it's the big difference with using Sourcery as the CLI version is that Sourcery CLI is going to generate code every time you build, whereas here it's one-off, like it's generated once and then it's part of the file. You can edit it, but it's not going to be regenerated unless you like ask for it specifically.
Yeah, so it works like a generator, like in Rails, for example, which has different use cases, because there are things that make sense for like CLI automatic integration, and there are things that are simply not doable. Like, for example, if you are using the TCA, right, the composable architecture from Point3, which is a really great Redux-based architecture, there's a lot of boilerplate that comes with it. So like if you have a structure describing your state, your application feature, like a feature state, for it to work with TCA, you have to usually want to create like a view state, action, reducer, and then a view that displays that. So 4 different entities right there. But with Sourcery Pro, you can just go and select this, and it immediately creates for you the I don't have the composable architecture included in the project, but it creates all of those entities for you, and you can see how much code it is, right? And if I simply included the framework, it would just have already the preview with all the data passed in automatically. So it's one of the templates that comes bundled with it. And another one that's very common is like, if you use TCA, you have the idea of case paths, which is the kind of like a reverse key path, right? So you can create from go the other way around, and that you can do that dynamically, but it's more efficient if you actually implement this code. So there's another template that creates this for you. So you can simply select that, and again, it generates a lot of different code for you, which is very, very, very useful if you want to save some performance. So it doesn't really matter what you are working on. There will be a lot of boilerplate in your code. One of the more standard ones, and something that I feel like every Sourcery Pro user would definitely use, is mocking, right? If you write tests, you have to write mocks. Just no way around it. And so if you have to write mocks, even for something like this, which only has like 5 variables and 1 function, a consistent mock is quite big. So let's see how it looks like. So if I go and generate a protocol mock here, you can see that it starts at line 17 and ends at line 76. That's a lot of lines that just generated like that, right? So, and you can see how consistent it is, right? Because you get, for every variable, for every function, you get the same kind of naming, the same kind of collection of data. So you can see the invocations of those methods. You can check how many times they were called, what arguments were passed. You can even return values from your functions if your function is the one that returns a value. And yeah, like here, for example, like we mock the switch color, right? So you can use the underlying switch color to both read it when the user of your protocol set it, or you can just fake it with your own values. Inside. Yeah. So this is, this is something that you do a lot. Like I give you an example. Bumble has 2,000 mocks. So 2,000, at least, well, I'd imagine their mocks are quite bigger than 4 variables. And so you can do the math, right? There is a lot of code that they generate with Sourcery. So with this, immediately saves you time, especially something like this. I usually just connect to a shortcut and just, whenever I have to write this code.
Super easily.
Yeah, just super easily. And, it's really powerful in that way. And there is so much more you could do with it. Like, for example, one of the things that I do is when I have to do the TCA, like the pattern in TCA is that you have to have an interface for your implementation, right? And this is pretty common pattern. So you can create mock first and then implement it. You can go the other way around. So if you're in your project, you want to start with the actual implementation of things and then create a protocol, you could do that by hand, or you could start with this auto interface protocol. And you can see that from real implementation of the user client, it created user client protocol, which simply exposes the same kind of interface, but as a protocol, and automatically conforms your type to it. So you save some time there as well. And there's like those kind of patterns appear so many times that it's like, because I get hired to help optimize projects, I'm trying to think if I found a single project that would not benefit from Sourcery. Even if you use a lot of generics, even if you use all the new features of the language, there is still a lot of code that you simply don't get, right? For example, key paths are awesome. Key paths are a really, really awesome feature. But there's a problem. You cannot get a list of key paths for your objects. Well, with Sourcery you can, right? Sourcery can generate that for you. And I use that in the automatic settings. So every setting that you can change is actually changed to a keypad. And it's also logged through a keypad. So I'm using generics, I'm using overloads, which is like a hidden, like there's a hidden attribute in SwiftUI that lets you overload the same function with different types. And this is really useful because it lets you have the same kind of DSL. So rather than having like, settings for float like that, where you have types that could be potentially like, applied to both by like doing type elevation. With the overload, you can just simply have settings and then have like a keypad. And you can do that for all different implementations. And with the disfavored overloading, that's the name. Like this, I think it's called. Yeah. So with this, what you can do is you can simply create this kind of function that depends on completely different types, and it finds the right type for you, regardless of the data you pass in. And this makes really cool DSL. But even with all those features, there's still so much boilerplate in the automatic settings. Like for the times I generate all the beta settings through Sourcery, and it's, I think right now 3,000 lines of code, and it's only 3,000 because it's SwiftUI. If it was UIKit, oh my God, I don't even want to get that number. And this is really, really powerful. So one of the reasons I built this is because there were some people that were afraid that adding normal Sourcery would create a dependency on their project, which isn't exactly the case, because Sourcery is not a dependency on the code base, because Sourcery is a build tool, right? So Sourcery generates Swift based on what you tell it to generate. which means that if it ever breaks, you simply disconnect it and you go back to maintaining that code by hand. Because without the Pro, if you have to write the enum codable, well, you can write this by hand, right?
It's just with code.
And yeah, it's just Swift code, and it's your code. You decide how it looks like, what's the structure. So if Sourcery ever broke, you could simply disconnect it and go back to doing that by hand. But all the time it worked, it would save you thousands of hours, and it's been working for the last 5 years. So I think it's a pretty good track record. It never broke. There was never like a failure in Sourcery not working at all. And so there are obviously bugs, as in every project. But I mean, who has not used Swift previews? Like, there are bugs in Xcode. Yeah, so one of the reasons I created Pro was because, okay, I'm gonna take away all your excuses for writing this code that is simply not necessary to write because you can generate it. And so you don't even need to tell your coworkers that you're using Pro because they will never know.
Yeah, that's right. You can do it like on your own and on your development machine, and in the merge request or in the pull request, it's not going to show anywhere. Actually, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and that brings a funny story. So Sarush, which is Sarush is another very prolific contributor in our community. He told me once a story that he was at a conference and one of the developers he spoke to was using Sourcery, but he didn't tell anyone in the company that he's using Sourcery, and so he volunteered to take all the test tickets. And he simply wrote a template once and generated all the tests and would just call it a day. So that's one of the use cases. Like, for example, to go back to the test example, right? So if you create a view using Swift UI form template, you can then also go and create a snapshot test for that Swift UI. And it generates to your clipboard, so you can just create a new file. I just pasted it here. And it also uses automatic support for the placeholders in Xcode, so you can simply go and fill in the missing data, which makes it very easy for you to write this, right? And you can see there's a lot, like you basically just generated from like a single structure. You generated both the view implementation and the base implementation of the tests, so you can see how that guy was saving time.
Yeah, and that's to make also a comparison. Like in Xcode, you already have some kind of code generation. For instance, as part of the refactor, you can like synthesize equatable. You can synthesize inits. So it's actually kind of the same level of feature, basically. I mean,
yeah, except
from a workflow perspective.
Yeah, it definitely is. Except it's very limited, and we waited years for this to be available. And you have like, oh, you can create member-wise initializer, but well, my structure is public. All my properties are public, but for some reason they implement this internal, which doesn't help me because the only reason I would be implementing this is, well, the only reason is if I want to use it in a different module, right? Because that's the only situation where you don't get the default initializer if you didn't override anything. So this is pointless, right? And with Sourcery, you can write your own that would not be doing this mistake, right? So it could infer the type based on your public structure. And I think we should just move to Sourcery Pro and just do it. What do you think?
Well, personally, I haven't used like that much the generation tool in Xcode because, yeah, as you said, it's actually pretty limited, and if you don't like agree with the template 100%, you don't have any way to like to fix the template. So when I saw Sourcery Pro like being announced, I was like, yeah, I definitely like see the use case, and I see that it can really like fit in a developer's workflow, basically.
Yeah, and the nice thing about this, well, this is actually the case. Like the case of not being able to tweak anything has been from the start. So once like I created Sourcery, everyone was using it for equality and hashing because that was just not supported by the language. Now we get that support, but if you have a simple structure, right? If you have like let's do a new file. So you have any kind of structure. some properties. But let's say you have like a property that's like some kind of cached ID, and you don't want to use it for equality because it's like, it's not computed necessarily, but it's transient.
Yeah.
And so if you use the derived implementation, you have no way of doing that, right? So they gave you the ability to generate this code by hand. So you can go, well, I keep using mine because mine just works better, but you can do that, right? So yeah, that's useful, but it still has all of those fields, so you have to manually maintain it. With Sourcery, you can do stuff like, you can do auto equality, and then you can use the annotations in the language, in Sourcery language, to just do skip equality, and then it will maintain that it never compares this. So this has always been an issue for them. But it makes sense because it's really complicated problem to solve in a universal way with tools like Sourcery. I can make some assumptions and some simplifications. I don't need to support all the language features, but I can still solve 95% of the problems that people face. So I think it's always a balancing game. So what I would suggest we do is we look at the standalone app, because those are templates that come bundled.
Just before we do, we actually have an interesting question in the chat. So the question is, so Clickbaking is asking, do you think Swift will get native public metaprogramming in the future?
Yeah, so when I originally released Sourcery, I spoke with Joe Groff about this, and he said that they want to have macros at some point. So macros as in not C macros, but more like Rust, AST-based macros, which is kind of like what Sourcery does. But that was 2016. He said it's not high priority. And just before I started working on Sourcery Pro, I spoke with another Apple engineer, and I explicitly asked, are they going to shadowlog Sourcery? Because I wouldn't start this project otherwise. And yeah, that has not been on the roadmap. So it's very complicated problem, because when you think about it, the way Sourcery works is like kind of like preprocessor, right? So you run Sourcery before you run your compilation phase. So it generates code, and then you have a source of truth, which is just your code. Explicit, there's no magic, there is no syntax rewriting happening, nothing like that. It's simply Swift code that you can debug and compile. When it's part of the language, that's much more complicated, because the compile phase now has a feedback loop, right? Because you have macros in your code that generate more code. And they generate it as part of the building, basically, right? Because we don't have preprocessor anymore, and it wouldn't be a preprocessor. So it's much more complicated problem to solve, because then, well, do you have to put some kind of restrictions? How do you debug it? Like, even from the tooling perspective, how are you going to, allow developers to actually know what's going on if their code breaks, right? This is a strongly typed language, which makes it much harder than, with Ruby, for example. And so it's not an easy problem to solve. It doesn't seem like it's going to get solved anytime soon. So I think at least for next few years, Sourcery is still going to be the community standard for this.
That's an interesting answer, because indeed, when you look at the Swift forums, you see there is often like talks on the topic. But as you said, like, there have been talks for years. So for the moment, for the foreseeable future, it's not something that should be expected.
Yeah, and it's nice, because like I don't get involved much in the Swift discussions, like the language discussions. I sometimes go and see something, and I see like references to Sourcery. And so it's pretty cool feeling that people are using this as an example of how things could work. But yeah, I mean, it's really complicated. Like the Sourcery is not that complicated, but if you have to build it into the language and into the actual tooling that they are doing, it's really hard problem to solve. So I'm not surprised it's not an easy thing that they can just, oh, here's macro system. Everyone right now was focused on the actor implementation when I spoke with the engineer. And I actually got inspired to write this tool, because like one of the questions he asked me was like what I would like to see improved in Xcode. And I was like, I threw a couple of ideas. And then I was like, well, I recently rewrote Sourcery parsing to no longer rely on source code. The problem with SourceKit was that it's a daemon running in the background, which means I couldn't run it from extension. And so when I realized that now that I rewrote it, I can actually create this tool, I was just so excited. Like, I spent working day to night. All my free time basically went into this.
And yeah, because actually it was developed like, how long did it take for you to make Sourcery Pro?
I think a little over a month, and that's, I still had full-time job.
Yeah, because that's what I remember, that between the moment you started saying you are working on something and the actual release, it was pretty quick actually. So I had this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm known for creating dev tooling that makes developers more efficient. So it's a good example that you can be efficient and do it fast.
Yeah, and plus it's when you think about it, I mean, I think it's the kind of project where you have to solve like a few problems in really like a big depth, but not a lot of like, you don't have to like spread yourself on too many things. It's like I think you must have like 1, 2, or 3 big problems. Is it that kind of project?
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, Sourcery Pro is like, it's extending on the work that I spent 5 years building, right? The Sourcery. So without Sourcery, there would be no Sourcery Pro, and that is doing the bulk of the complexity, which I spent a lot of time working on, but it was spread over like 5 years. Whereas with Sourcery Pro, like the biggest problems were like, how do I make the developer experience as good as possible? So like creating this editor, I'm going to describe how all this works, but in general, like, how do I create an experience for people to write their own templates in a very easy way, even if they never used Sourcery before? And that was like the key for me. Like, I don't want this to be used by people that are Sourcery users. Like, they obviously will, because it's amazing experience for writing actual Sourcery templates as well. But I want this to be used by pretty much every developer that just wants to save time. And it costs like $20 still. Like, I'm going to raise the price in 2 weeks, but it's like $20. And if it doesn't save you a few hours in the first week, I would be very surprised. So it's like the only reason I made it paid, not free, because I wanted to write first. That was my first mock-up, and I didn't do a commercial side project in many years. And I've been doing open source for like a decade now. So I wanted something to actually, generate some revenue so I can spend more time doing Sourcery and stuff like that. But I didn't want to make it very expensive. I didn't want any kind of subscription or any kind of revenue model that would prevent people from getting it. And with this price, it's basically no-brainer. Like, I have all the reviews on the App Store, like 5 stars, and companies are buying it for their whole teams. So I think I did a pretty decent job, and I'll show people in a second how all of this works. But yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't so much about making money. It was like, this is an exciting problem to solve, and I can show Apple how this could work, because I think this is far more powerful than what Xcode offers. And because it allows you to basically create your own templates very easily, it just makes you more efficient, because there is just so much boilerplate in our code bases. It doesn't matter what project you're working on. There will be, like, if I went to that project, I will find a lot of examples where you could automate it.
And so in the chat, people are saying that it's indeed $20 very well spent when they bought Sourcery Pro. And so you were about to show us. So what we are seeing on the screen, it's the Sourcery Pro app, we could say.
Yes. So let me just open it in this form. And so let's start with what's visible before I go into like editing features and how you build your own templates. So on the left, you have a list of templates. If you get the application, you start with bundled templates. If you ever, remove them, you can just go and restore them here. Pretty simple. And you can switch, obviously. And here you have the template, or you can look at the sample code. So basically, think about this like a test case, right?
Yeah.
So this is all the code that your project would have, and this is all the boilerplate it would generate from it.
Yeah.
So this is like a very, very good example. I actually opened this randomly, but it's a very good example of how much code you can be saving, right? So this basically creates a match functionality on enums, which means that you can transform specific enums with like specific cases with associated values into proper types. So if you wanted to go from like enum with just some values to a fully typed object, you can simply use this function, and it generates generic function. So you can create your own instances. Very convenient if you're like going through the API mapping, for example. And it also generates ability for you to check whether it matches. So it's more like conversion is one thing, like transformations, but also like doing a chain, more functional checks for your data. But yeah, so you select between sample and template, and you see the generated code. The generated code is always on the right, and you can obviously hide it. There are keyboard shortcuts for pretty much everything. You can see the editor keyboard shortcuts here. There's a lot. It's a fully fledged editor. I'm gonna show you, how it works in a few minutes. On the right, every template has its own setting. So similar like in Xcode, you have the inspector. You have it here as well. So you can see that Thomas created this composable feature template. And this is basically the one I showed before, that from a simple struct, it creates the view state, the view, the reducer, and the action system for TCA. And you have description. It automatically picks up the links if there is a link in the description. You can select the language. You can use either EJS, which is effective JavaScript, or Stencil. But you definitely want to use Stencil, because that's where I put in all the work to do like a very, very good experience. EJS already has some basic tooling, but Stencil is just working really well in this application, as you'll see. And you can select the run mode. Everything has a description, so you can read it and understand how it works. And you have this idea of run against, and that is basically how it's supposed to run in Xcode. So when you use the extension, it can run either against the current selection, which might be just you putting your cursor over the structure name, or selecting some piece of code. So that's how selection works. Or you can run it against whole file. And the difference here is basically, do you want to be very specific in your, like if you have multiple types in your file, do you want to generate this code just for the single file, or do you want to generate like this single structure, or do you want to generate it for all the structures in your file? So that's the case. I usually use selection and I use key bindings, because if I'm explicit, then I want to be more explicit. That's just the way I like it. And then you have insertion mode, and basically this is kind of bound to the other one. But it works this way, right? So you can either insert something into declaration body, as you saw in some examples. I was extending the current file, the current type. I can actually show you a good example of this. So you saw I was doing the enum codable, right? And by default, this extension comes bundled. This comes bundled as an extension to your type, rather than the type itself.
Yeah.
But if you go here and you change insert into end of file into declaration body instead, and you simply modify this template, so like I'm going to remove this extension and I'm going to remove this, and because this is fully flat editor, I have multiple cursors, so I can just select this code and indent it, and let's add a new line here just for formatting. So I do this and I go back into my enum codable. It was an extension before, and I run it now. It's no longer an extension.
It's inside the type itself.
Yes, it's inside the type, and as you saw, it correctly implemented it basically. So it's really simple to change. But the other options are, you can add the code at the start of your file, you can add it at the end, or you can copy it into pasteboard. The example I did with the snapshots uses the pasteboard, because the flow is, you usually want to put that code into a separate file, so it optimizes it for you, pastes it into pasteboard. You just do Command-Shift-N, create new file, and paste it in. So that's the basic settings. You can also use the trim white space, which basically just means whether it should be removing the trailing and leading white spaces. So if I remove the new line marker and I remove this, if I start adding spaces, it's going to be there, but based on your template, it can remove like extra stuff. Basically, just really depends on the stencil. The stencil language is like not handling this very well, so it really depends on the kind of code you write.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, those are the basic setups. the other, like obviously you can collapse everything, right? You can focus on the editor, and you have a bunch of settings. So if you go into preferences, or just, you can just press Alt, comma, which is the standard shortcut, and you can select the color theme. There's over 20 different ones. You can select where you want light or dark mode, and there's a lot of different preferences, whatever people like. Oh, this is interesting. I like Dracula or Vibrant Ink. I think they're pretty cool. And you can obviously change the font sizes, but you can do it like the same as in Xcode. You can just use plus minus. So there's a lot of different options. You can use the wrap mode, so you can wrap to the view. So if I resize the window, you can see that it wraps the code for you. And yeah, it's really very configurable. You can show the margins here, and then you can choose whether to use soft or hard spaces for the tab size. So it's really up to your preferences. And yeah, so like the other thing is the templates you can select whether to show them or hide them in Xcode. You can select whether to synchronize this with files. So for example, you can put your templates in Git and just use that as a source of truth. You can clone them, obviously. You can export them, so it creates a file on your disk, and you can drag and drop files. So if you have a template from someone else, you can simply drag it on this list, and it will automatically get imported. What else is there? Like the next version that coming in 2 weeks is the cloud support, so people will be able to share their templates straight into CloudKit.
Oh,
and yeah, I imagine that will be very interesting because there will be a lot of different templates being shared by people. People were already sending me a lot of different templates they use in their projects, but having something globally that doesn't involve me having to add it to the application will be very convenient. And what's really cool, so the bulk of my work went into creating this editor experience. So if I go into one of the templates, if anyone has worked with Stencil before, they know it's not very good language for error reporting. So if you have the generated code and you make some kind of mistake, this is basically what happens. It tells you that there's like for statement that's broken, but it doesn't tell you where. It doesn't tell you, how to fix it or anything like that, which is very inconvenient, especially for people that are new to this language. But with my editor, it tells you exactly where. And you don't even have to, you can just press F4, it will jump to the error. It gets even more visible if you do more complex errors. So for example, if I forget to close this tag, this error didn't change. It's still the same error, but now in my editor, you have 2 different errors and it tells you exactly what's wrong, right? So much more powerful. But like to show you some of the examples of how you can create your own templates and go over some of the features of the editor, let's just create a new template. So if I go into the example we did, and let's see what Xcode generates, right? So we go refactor, generate member-wise initializer. So this is how Xcode generates it. So the best way to create a new template, in my experience, has been usually just to copy the code. So if I go and create a new template, every template starts with the base structure and base sample code. And the base structure is basically iterating over all type instances and just printing the name. So pretty much all the code you're going to write is going to be starting with like a main for loop.
Yeah.
And you want to set up your test code first. So I have the structure and a class here, but I'm going to just replace it with that basic stuff. So I'm just going to clean it up.
Makes sense.
So I have three variables here. And now what I want to create is that initializer, right? So if I copy this initializer here, and let's see what we can do with it. So I'm going to inset all of this so it's more visible. And I'm going to hide this. Is the font size okay, or should I increase it?
Maybe you can increase a bit.
Right.
Yeah, that should be perfect.
So we have, this is basically how it looked like. So the first thing we want is the access level. Unlike Xcode, which is wrong, because when I have it all public, so let's actually add it here. So if I make this public, and I make all of them public just to be sure, what Xcode generates is still internal. So that should be the first thing we want to change, right? So I don't want this to be internal. I want this to express whatever the type does. So, well, it's actually A because it's access level. So it's the first thing that the code completion suggested. And as you can see, this is basically the type access level. So I'm just going to press enter, and immediately this is already working, right? Then
and that's the next improvement for people who've been using Sourcery and written stencil by hand, is that so now you have code completion, and that's a cool addition.
Yeah, you have code completion with all the inline documentation. So I'm gonna refactor this a little so I have it more in this structure, because I just want it like that for readability. I'm gonna collapse this, and so we have initializer, and then what we need to do is we need to iterate over every single variable that's stored, right? So what I can do is I can use for loop, which is, well, for loop, right? Snippet. And so I can do variable in type, and then it should have some variables. And you can see there are different options for you. So do you want to use stored variables? I think we want to use stored variables. And just to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do variable.name. Okay, and so it's already generating the names of the variables. I should probably rename them. They're confusing. Okay. And let me just change one thing because it's driving me crazy. I want 2 spaces. And so that's the first thing, right? And as we look in this template, the next thing that comes after the variable name is the type name. So if I go into variable and then I want type, but I don't want type because that's the full AST. I don't care about that. What I want is the type name. So I'm just going to use that. And I already have this, right? So it's exactly the same as here. And then if I want a comma, but I only want a comma if it's not the last thing. So that's a little annoying. But what I can use is I can use an if snippet, and let's see what variables there are, right? So if I have an if snippet and I just press Ctrl-Alt, it will suggest me all available variables in this context. So I have type, I have variable, and I have for loop. Let's see what's for loop. So for loop offers me a counter 0, first, last, and length. So what I want is if it's last, then I want comma, but it's not. I want the reverse, right? So
yeah,
let's just remove the formatting. So I want this. Okay. And if it's not, for loop last, that's what I want. And I don't want this useless white space. And so I already have this. This is looking pretty similar. Okay, so I can remove this code. This is no longer necessary. We're already matching it. And now what I want to do is I want to create this. So this is kind of very similar, right? Because I just have another for loop, except this time I'm doing self dot variable, and it should be equal to also variable name. And I don't need this anymore. And I have the same code. Right? Exactly the same. But let's make it a little more interesting. So if there was a default value here,
yes,
I want that value to also be in the initializer as the default. Yeah. So let's see. We have this, and basically here we want to add it, right? The default, if it exists. So let's see if we have an option for that. So let's first see. Oh, there is. So variable default value expression. So it's gonna basically paste in the expression, as you can see. And the only thing I need to do is,
if there is no default value, you need to like not write the equal sign. So yeah.
Yeah. So if not, or actually if variable default value, then I'm gonna generate it. And then I'm just gonna close this ended.
Yeah.
Okay, and I just want to wipe this here. And now I have this already supported. And if this was more complicated, like if this was some kind of expression that's being calculated, it would just paste it the same way. So it works exactly the same. And so we wrote this template. Let's name it something more obvious. Okay. and I need to restart Xcode because that's Xcode limitation if you add something new. Unfortunately, it doesn't query your templates. So you can edit it live as you saw before with the uncodable, but you cannot add new content. It just simply doesn't add it. So if I go here and just go like this, it generated it. But it generated it outside of this definition. So let's just open Sourcery quickly and do declaration body. Everything else seems fine. I didn't have to restart, and I go here and do better member wise. And it's internal now, but what happens if I change it to public, right? So let's use the same kind of template. So like this, and then let's compare it, let's do it twice. So let's do this one, it's internal, and let's do this one. It's public. So this is actually useful for using it across the modules, and obviously it's a layer declaration, but it obviously works. And so much more convenient, and it took me like, what, 4 minutes when I had to explain. What's really cool, like this, so this is kind of annoying that you have to match the formatting. You can use stuff like you can build functions, so you can create macros that basically are functions in this. So like you can do and call it some function, and then you can provide a type information, let's say variable. But Stencil is not type language, so it wouldn't know what variable it is. It just knows it's a local variable, like a local storage. But I added ability to add types, so I can do typed, and then again I build in full call completion. So I just press Control space, and it tells me what variables are unknown type, which is the only one variable, and then it tells me the next keyword that I can use is as, and then it gives me a list of all the types Sourcery knows. I can find the type that I want to map it to. So I'm going to do variable here. And let's say I want, sorry?
Now I was saying, and then locally inside the macro is going to be typed as the variable.
Yes, it's typed now, and so it has full intelligence now. So what I can do is, for example, I can expose this code. And here, rather than call, like I can just call it. So I can use call. Well, actually, I can also use some function, and it will give it for me. So it generates the same kind of code, but now I extracted part of it. And you can do it for everything. So you could extract this as a macro as well, and simplify your structure a lot doing that. There is also like set tags, so you can do like local variables. So for example, like this, you can specify some variable name, and then again, you might probably want to use typed, or like it will work without it, but because I generate errors for you, you probably want to type it, because if you don't type it, basically what's going to happen is, so let's do this. In this loop, I'm going to do variable.name. So it's basically just a local variable that matches this. And so if I try to print it, you see, basically just repeats it, right? So I can do transformations here. So like I could do, it also suggests filters. So I can do like upper first letter, and you can see that foo is now foo. So I can do transformations and basically save code again using this. Don't have to repeat yourself. What's really cool about this stuff is that, whenever you make a mistake, it will tell you. So you can see there are like 3 errors. And what's really cool about the editor, if you press F1, you can see a list of all the options you have to do. So you can do a lot of different stuff. And for example, well, one of the first ones it suggests is go to next error. So you simply press that, and it will tell you and put the cursor exactly where the problem started. So very convenient for you to write this code. As you see, like you don't have to look into external documentation, because everything here has inline documentation as long as you use types. So either if you are using the main structure or if you use functions, you simply have to add this line, and you immediately get all the IntelliSense. And there's a lot of different stuff you can be using, and it supports proper nesting. So if I do this, I can see all the type stuff. So if I go types and I go like all the imports, And then the only thing that imports has, because it's an array, is a count. But if I do like 0, for example, then I can see, those are features that do not exist in normal stencil, but they exist in Sourcery Pro. Because how this works, this has nothing to do with normal stencil. This is all written from scratch by me. I had to write my own tokenization, my own highlighting, my own code completion. Basically, everything is just made so you can write this code very easily. Whether you have ever seen stencil or not, there's just a couple of fields, and whenever you start with a new template, you already start with the base. So if you have the base, you simply press Control Space, and it will tell you what kind of data you have. And if you're a programmer, most of the time that's going to be enough.
Yeah.
For like the 90% of templates you're going to write, the stuff you want to do is you want to do for loops. And so you want to do like snippet and then like variables and jump in like type instance variables or, instance methods, or like, let's do methods. Let's see, instance methods. So this is already, again, typed, right? So it will see, okay, there is a method. What method has whole name? Let's see what's that.
And it's true that when I was writing Sourcery templates, so just in a plain text editor, like the process was very often, okay, so I have a variable, what field can I call on it? And then I have the field, okay, what type it is? And you are just like moving between like the editor and the documentation. So it's nice to see the workflow being much more efficient here.
Yeah, so you have like I would have to look at the documentation before, so that's not surprise to me. So you have call name, but you have like selector, for example, and you can see it matches whatever you have here. So it's very, very convenient, like, and it makes it so much more streamlined. So like creating new templates for yourself, it's really, really straightforward.
And talking about now Sourcery and how the project is architectured, there is a very interesting question in the chat, so I'm going to display it. And it's Andrea asking, do you think it is possible to do a port for other languages? And I think it's meant as other programming languages. So which parts are specific to Swift and which part are, we could say, like more generic?
Well, I mean, it's using, so the thing is, the way Sourcery works, Swift is source of truth, but people are generating different code. Like I know people that are generating Kotlin, I know people that are generating JavaScript from it. If you have a project that has multiple platforms and you can make Swift the source of truth, then you can write a template that just generates anything. Because Sourcery doesn't define what kind of code you want to generate. It can generate documentation. You can use it to query the language, like you can query the project for interesting bits. So for example, if you do like, if you have your template, you could simply do, rather than having a loop, you could just do types all count. And then the more types you add, the more statistics you get. And you can do that. You can find inheritance chains. So for example, I have a script. I have a Sourcery template that's like, I think 3 lines of code that generates how do you pronounce it? AWK, the command line tool, AWK script that adds final to every single class in a project that doesn't have inheritance, doesn't get inherited from. So it automatically rewrites all your source code, and it's like a Sourcery template you run first, and then you simply execute the output, because the output is a shell script. As for different languages, obviously, because it's using Swift syntax, it wouldn't work if the Kotlin was source of truth. The editor could work if you have the same, like if you had the same AST. And the AST definition for me, that's just something I code generated, obviously. So like the editor itself, like the stencil language rules are written, they're not specific to Sourcery. There are some extensions I added for convenience, but they are not Sourcery related. They're just like type annotation, stuff like that. But you would have to have AST information, right? So if different language had a different parser, it could work. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think there is like, I looked at Kotlin, but I don't think there was something like that for it.
Yeah, plus Kotlin, I mean, they have more like native metaprogramming. So I guess I mean, you can generate like you already have the annotation that can generate code in Java and Kotlin. So, but it's interesting
Yeah,
what you
because
said,
it's
like
Java, right?
the fact that the output of Sourcery can be anything is true. Like we didn't mention it, but for instance, like from a struct, you could generate JSONs with maybe like with mistakes in the JSON to test that your decoding is correct. So you could do like there is no limit on what you are outputting from Sourcery.
I'm gonna see if I have this script in my in my files. 1 second.
And I'm just checking the chat in the meantime. And of course, if you have questions, please write them in the chat.
Yeah, so actually I wrote it in Edge.js, not in Stencil. So this is how let's do it. This is how the template looks like.
I think it's the first time I'm seeing AJS code.
So basically, this is still very old template. Like I did it a few years back, so the AST changed a little. But basically, if type wasn't attributed with open or final, and there was no typed based, so you can check like you can check inheritance like that. It would generate first it generate git grep for that class definition, and then it would generate Xargs and Perl code to rewrite the classes. So if I executed the template first, it would generate all the calls for every class that requires rewrite, and then I would just execute this script. I just put it in shell file and simply rewrote all the source code. I remember I did a PR like that, and it changed like hundreds of classes in the Times project. So you can generate really anything. This is pretty crazy, honestly.
It's really like a super smart way of doing it. Like actually, I had never thought that you could indeed like generate a script where everything is hard coded, but you've generated the hard coded part using Sourcery. That's super interesting.
Yeah, it's the people are using it for documentation. It's not ideal. Like it can do documentation from code. Like I did a talk at DC iOS and iOS Soho crossover. Like I have it on my website, where I showed an architecture in which I'm using Sourcery to do parsing from like a tags. So I have like Markdown. So I have like a widget, and then I have like argument one, whatever. So I have something like this, right, in free text. And Sourcery generates parsing for that based on just the structure of data. And it generates documentation. It automatically registers you into the system. So the only thing as a developer you have to do is you create your object that implements a specific widget. Everything else is automated. Like every single piece of code is automated. The only thing you do is you focus on your feature. And it's extremely powerful, and it makes the whole development team much more efficient.
And I was looking at the question. So we have one question about the fact that so do you think someone will make an alternative to Stencil? You had to add Band-Aid on top of Stencil, which could be a sign that it's not really made for modern Swift. Swift template was even worse. It's true that in terms of templating language, like for instance, I know that Sourcery supported Swift also as a templating language. Which is the one that you recommend the most to use?
So there are three languages I support, and Sourcery, the way I implemented Sourcery is fully modular. So all of the language support is just a simple framework. You can add your own languages. The only Band-Aid I did for Stencil is really type attribution, but that has nothing to do with the language. I basically built a very powerful editor for Stencil, and I didn't use Stencil because Stencil just doesn't give me the information. But with the edit, for the fact I had to do it all myself, I was so tempted to write my own language. But there are 40,000 apps using Stencil. Well, most of them are using Stencil, and so I don't think you need to change a language, right? Most of this code is really simple. Most of the templates are not very complicated. And the thing is, even when I rewrote the AST parsing to Swift syntax, I changed very little in the actual AST models. I made it so that it's as close to the original as possible, because I didn't want to get like 40,000 apps complaining that I broke their flow, right? That's a big problem when you have popular project. But it's verbose language for sure, but it's not hard, and most of this code is actual Swift. So you have most of the definitions is just whether you're using like a call to get some extra logic, but in general it's not hard to read, especially with the Pro, right? Like with normal editing, it's terrible, right? That's why I wrote this. Normal editing is really hard, even for myself as an author. Writing this always required me to go and read the documentation. Like I would literally just go Sourcery reference, like what are the attributes, how I can do it. But now I can just go, like I didn't look at this template in years, and I just go here and I can see, okay, so there are annotations and this is how it works. Or I can go and like, okay, so there are associated values and that's an array. So and what's really cool, like for example, if you have this binding, right, for value in case associated values, it's an array, so it works. But what if I try to bind it to something else, like for example this, which isn't an array, so it shouldn't work, right? Well, it doesn't work. It would tell you that you tried to do something on a wrong type. So basically what I added is I added the editor understanding of types and AST of Sourcery, but it's not really I didn't really change anything in stencil language itself. This is all just Sourcery Pro like extensions, which is just literally this, right? This is the real extension. Everything else is just me parsing it and stuff like that. But that didn't change anything. Like I didn't have to change anything in the actual language. So it works. It's a little verbose, but I mean, you usually write those templates once and don't change it for years. So I don't think it's really worth it. Like I was really tempted to do like, oh, I wanna build better language. But so we have Swift templates, which Kruno Zaher added, the guy that made Eric Swift. I would definitely not recommend using Swift templates. They are the slowest because they are using actual Swift, and they are worse to read. The only limitation of stencil that you might run into is the fact this is not a Turing complete language, right? This is not like a fully blown programming language. It's a templating language. If you need a fully blown language, just use Edge.js, because Edge.js is executed. It's not compiled, which makes it fast, and you want this to be fast. I could not use Swift templates here because they require you to run Swift compiler and then execute out of process, which obviously wouldn't work with the fact that the extension is sandboxed. But I wouldn't even want to because they're really slow. You can see, like, if you go into Xcode and you try to generate something, how fast it is, right? It's immediate. You basically press it and it's just gonna work.
Yeah.
There is no delay, there is no spinning, there is nothing like that. It processes, like I did measurement and it was like not even 100th of a second. So yeah, I was tempted, but I evaluated, the pros and cons, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but especially with this experience. Like in the past, what's annoying because the language is not very good for parsing and understanding. But when you get inline errors, when you break stuff, and you can just press F4 and just jump between errors and see exactly what's wrong, I don't think it's a big deal.
It's interesting what you say, the fact that, yeah, when you make a developer tool, like, you need to make compromise because you have to have good performance, but also when you make a choice in a developer tool, if the tool becomes popular, you will never be able to basically like change it in the future, because you're going to break just so many workflows that you're kind of like, yeah, you have to keep on with it. So when you want to make a developer tool, you really don't have to think about these choices.
Yeah, like I rewrote the whole parsing, right? I basically threw away the old parser, but I had to retrofit some of the new information into old AST because otherwise, like, so many apps would break. So most users should not even notice that there is like a new parser, except their build times will disappear because it's like, for example, Airbnb code base is like 2 million lines. and on their code base, it's 12 times faster, the newest version of Sourcery, than it was like half a year ago. So you're gonna notice, like your build time is gonna notice, your CPU usage is gonna notice, your memory usage is gonna notice, but you shouldn't. You shouldn't need to. We didn't have to change a single template in the times, and some of them are 5 years old. So it's usually like the time you invest into this. This is not a code you have to update, really. The AST, like I designed the AST in a way to be resilient. So it's really, really rare that I have to go and change a template once I write it. And it's usually when I want to add a feature to the code generation, like I want to generate something else. But other than that, like I literally don't remember a single time. Maybe there was like 2 years ago, like I had to change like 2 lines of template because I expanded the AST. But since then, I don't think I changed anything.
So it's a good, definitely like a good quality for a developer tool to be able to like be resilient over time. So
yeah, I think it's important.
I was looking at the chat and I think we've answered all the questions, and actually we have made 1 hour of content. So I think it was a good, very good live, good episode. We've seen what Sourcery Pro is. We've seen that it comes built in with some templates that can be called directly from Xcode. Then we've seen the editor, the fact that we can create our own template with a nice developer experience when you are writing your own template. So I think like if you want to get Sourcery Pro, well, we have the link in the description. If you want to try to get a free license, remember that you can retweet the tweet. Once again, the link is in the description, and there are 10 licenses to win tomorrow. And yeah, I think in conclusion for the episode, I can just say like thank you, Krzysztof, for showing us how it works, for answering this question about behind the scene, how it has been implemented.
Thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure.
And thank you all for just interacting and watching this live. Thank you all, and see you next week for another live. Bye bye.